Hey everyone. Today we're going to be talking about federalism. My notes are pretty long, and I don't want to make this video go too long. So what I'm going to do is post the lecture notes alongside with the video. So just so you have it. A quick note on that. I don't always use notes, but when I do, I will provide them. I'm not one of those professors where it's like I always throw up the PowerPoints because I don't always have PowerPoints or I don't always have notes. Sometimes I'm just looking at a graph, and interpreting it. So, anyway, yeah. So I'll post those notes. So yeah, let's get into federalism. So let's define it first. Hopefully you guys remember from federal government, if you've taken federal government, that federalism is a system of government that divides power between the national government and the state governments. So in America, both the state and the federal government are sovereign in different areas. So sovereignty is tied to federalism because sovereignty is like the legitimate governing power of a government, governing power of a government. But yeah, like the final authority, the legitimacy, to be sovereign is to be like the sole arbiter of what that thing is, I guess. That'd be a good way to describe it. Anyway, so how that gets back into federalism is that the state is sovereign and the federal government is sovereign, which makes sense in theory, but as we'll see, it can get a little complicated. But yes, that is essentially the system, and one of the benefits of federalism is that it generally is accommodating to nations with diverse ethnic or language groupings or geography or any of these descriptors. It's good at bringing together a groups of people that aren't homogenous, because each region, or in our case state, has the ability to be sovereign in their own spheres, if that makes sense, and so they have more control over maybe individual things, the individual day-to-day life, so to speak. So yeah, anyway, let's move on. So why do we have a federalist system? Go back to the Articles of Confederation. Remember that? We had a weak central government. There was no president. Members of Congress were chosen and paid by the states so they could take away members of Congress or stop paying their salary, which would essentially mean they have to go home. That could happen. Each state had only one vote, regardless of population size, and all 13 states had to agree to make amendments. Some more issues, because you can indeed go on. Congress couldn't even tax and spend. They couldn't even tax. They couldn't even, spend money. They didn't have a standing army. They couldn't enforce treaties. So clearly we have a very, very weak central government during the Articles of Confederation. And one of the biggest things was that we didn't have a standing army. So if you guys remember Shays' Rebellion, it was when that Daniel Shay, that former army captain, led a mob of farmers against the Massachusetts government because they couldn't pay their debts. Like, they were farmers and they were in debt, but at the same time, the government also owed them back pay for fighting the revolution. So the government technically had debt too, and this made that mob of farmers very angry. The rebellion failed, but only because the higher, like, the wealthy people were able to hire mercenaries. Honestly, like a bunch of sellswords coming in. And yeah, neither the Massachusetts or the national government was able to stop it. Massachusetts because its militia was ineffective. National government because they didn't have an army, and it made them look really bad. It's like, ooh, not a good look. So those were some of the reasons why it became clear that we needed a new type of government. Because clearly, let me back up. All sovereignty, going back to sovereignty during the Articles of Confederation, it was heavily in the favor of the individual states, right? So the final governing authority was given to the states. The national government was given authority by the states, but could essentially have been revoked by the states because the states were sovereign. They were more sovereign, right? So that's why we need a different system where sovereignty is better distributed between state and federal governments. So that's ultimately what we try to do in our Constitution. That's essentially what the goal was to balance state power with federal power. And, and as we will see, it's changed a lot over time. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about the Constitution as it pertains to this. So the U.S. Constitution grants two types of power to Congress. In Congress and or the federal government. You could also read it that way. But these are called expressed and implied powers, right? They have the express powers and the implied powers. The express powers are the specific powers in the Constitution that are granted to Congress and the President, right? There are 17, and they are found in Article 1, Section 8. And I've got a slide here that you guys will be able to see. So that's the express powers, right? They are expressed, they are written down. They are literally right there. You don't have to interpret, they are right there. For example, to borrow money, to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, to coin money, etc. Now the other power, and this is where it gets fun. This is where the politics starts to come in. Like this is where it should start, making your gears spin. The implied powers enable Congress to make laws that are necessary and proper to execute the expressed powers. So, what does that mean? Okay, let's focus first on the necessary and proper part. Necessary and proper, that's the necessary and proper clause, if you ever heard of that. The necessary and proper clause, the necessary and proper clause. You'll hear it all the time now. This means, the necessary and proper clause means that Congress can do all of the things it needs to do in order to do those 17 things it knows for sure it's supposed to do, if that makes sense. So, you can get so it's like, let me try to explain it. Let me try to explain it. Okay, how about this? To coin money and regulate its value. To regulate weights and measures. Okay. To coin money. Okay, makes sense. That's something the federal government should do. But how does the government go about coining money? What if, in order to mine the resources for money, the federal government had to take over some land, and maybe even it might have displaced some of the, the natives that were living there, right? The federal government can't do that, right? Well, it depends on if it's necessary and proper in order to carry out the coining of money. You guys see what I mean here? I think that's wild. So the federal government, just remember, the federal government can always has that in its back pocket. It can always just pull out its necessary and proper clause. Now, do they do it all the time? No, because again, there's politics involved, and politics kind of keeps things, for better or worse, the status quo, for better or for worse. Okay, next, let's talk about the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 specifies that the laws of Congress shall be the supreme law of the land. Supremacy clause makes sense why they call it that. But this essentially means that if there's a conflict between national and state law, national law prevails, right? There is no tiebreaker. National law will always win the tiebreaker. I guess you could say that. This kind of goes right back to sovereignty. So the states are sovereign, in the federal government is sovereign, but if there's ever a conflict between who is more sovereign in a particular instance, it's always going to be the federal government. That's the supremacy clause. It's really, as long as you can remember that that's what that's talking about, it makes perfect sense. So what powers do the states have? Because now it seems like the federal government has all power. Well, the 10th Amendment is what preserves the strong role for state government. The 10th Amendment gives powers that the Constitution does not delegate to the national government or prohibit to the states are reserved to the states. So, here's an example. I know that sounds confusing maybe, but so what this means is that anything that anything of those 17 powers that the federal government is like expressly allowed to do or supposed to do, plus things that the states cannot do. Like, for example, an individual state like Texas cannot have treaties with other governments. So Texas can't do any deals with Russia because that would be a conflict of national interest, going back to the Supremacy Clause. And if interests, conflict, especially when it comes to national security, the federal government always wins. So that would be an example of something that the 10th Amendment doesn't cover. But the point is that 10th Amendment covers everything else. Everything other than those 17 and the necessary and proper clause. The states get to do all of that. So that's why most of the regulations or lack thereof in our daily lives are Texas laws just as much as they are federal laws, and in some cases more in Texas laws. So there are some powers that the federal and state government share. These are called concurrent powers. So these powers are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some of them are. Some of them, like establish foreign policy. A state cannot establish foreign policy, but there are things that both the federal and state government can do. And these would include maintain law and order, levy taxes, borrow money, charter banks, establish courts, and provide public services for the people, like public welfare. So yeah, there's definitely some overlap there. The next part we need to talk about is how federalism has changed over time. So basically, I would say the TLDR version is it started very compartmentalized and separated. It's like the federal government does this, the state government does this, it's cool. Everything's good. And then it got more complicated, and the federal government and the state government have kind of merged and not merged, not at all. Sorry. The dividing lines between jurisdictions or levels of government start to overlap to a point where it's hard to necessarily know in every instance. I guess you could say that. But this essentially started with the New Deal and moved onward. That's the short version. Let me jump into it a little bit. So going back to the beginning, the federal government was small, and it dealt primarily with foreign affairs and commerce. It built things like roads, bridges, and canals. It raised revenue through tariffs, and provided infant industries protection from competition. So that's, regulating a healthy and efficient, free market. It protected patents and provided a common currency. It was very pro business, and it had a light touch. And if anything, what its touch was doing was pushing you towards the market anyway. So states' rights people would say that those were the good old days, at least in that regard. So what that meant is that state legislators performed the majority of governing over the citizens' day-to-day lives. So the states handled the economic regulation of, all of these market incentives, as well as, provided for things like private property, and then criminal laws, from trespass to murder, have always normally been state laws. States administer education and oversee education. Yes, the federal government, will provide guidelines and sometimes even requirements. But more often than not, the state gets to decide what they are going to teach the students. So the next thing to talk about here is the Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause is very important because it delegates to Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So this is one of those express powers. The Peacetime Powers, Clause 3, to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Yeah, I can see it in the chart. So this essentially means that the federal government has the ability to oversee the economy or to regulate an economy. What does that mean? I mean, who quite knows? It depends on your interpretation. But what happened is that the Supreme Court had a series of rulings that expanded federal power through the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. So as the Supreme Court started to interpret cases that came up that dealt with commercial issues, they started to see the Commerce Clause in a certain way, and it started to mean something different and started to change. So let's talk about that. The first court case is McCulloch versus Maryland. This ruling affirmed that the U.S. government had, through its implied powers, their legal right to charter a national bank. So this is important because I believe it was definitely Maryland. Maryland didn't like that the federal government had started a bank, and so what they did is their bank made a new rule that said something like interstate banks must pay a tax or something. Or, interstate banks or out-of-state banks must pay a tax or whatever. But they wrote it in such a way that the only people that was talking about was the federal government. So essentially what they were doing was trying to tax the federal government as a way of getting back at them. And that's ultimately the pettiness that led to the court case. But at any rate, what happened is the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had the power to establish a national bank in order to regulate interstate commerce, which is using the necessary and proper clause. Making a bank is necessary and proper to regulating interstate commerce. Make sense? So the federal government then started to have more power to use the Commerce Clause, essentially. Where are we at? Okay. Now, the next one is Gibbons v. Ogden. This ruling established the supremacy of the national government in all matters affecting interstate commerce. So essentially what happened here was that there was this dude in New York, and he had a monopoly, and apparently it was provided to him by New York. Like, apparently there was an agreement. Like, I don't know if they shook hands, but, you know. But essentially this guy had a monopoly on ferry rides from New York to New Jersey. You know, he was the only guy that could get you across in that area, I guess, and he probably just charged a ton of money. That's super New York / New Jersey. I'm not from there, but that doesn't help with the generalizations, you know. Anyway, the Supreme Court said you can't do that because, you know, going from New York to New Jersey is interstate commerce. You know, the ferry ride takes place, you know, out once it leaves New York, it's now interstate commerce, right? That makes sense? So again, the federal government has the power to regulate things like that. So that kind of gave the federal government a little bit more power, and then, you know, history happens, and that takes us up to essentially the Great Depression. So the Great Depression decimated the entire economy. You know, we as a country were looking for some answers, and we were not opposed. The public opinion was not totally opposed to government stepping in if they could take care of this. So popular support plus the Great Depression, what that equaled was FDR's New Deal. More regulation of businesses, more rights for laborers, guaranteeing a good wage so they can, you know, continue to feed their family during the Depression, and the changing view that the economy had become a national economy. And that's the big kicker, because if the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce, the Great Depression affected every state. Maybe it didn't affect them all the exact same, but it affected every state. So what that means is that whether we like it or not, everyone's economy is kind of linked, because what happens in one area affects the other. What happens in Wall Street affects everyone. So clearly we're linked, right? At least that was the rationale of the New Dealers. But yeah, so the federal government came in and took more control over regulating the economy, and that led to FDR's New Deal. So this included, federal jobs programs. They built parks, roads, schools, allowed businesses to coordinate production decisions, so everyone could stay in business. It was less free market, but it was more, but it was a progressive approach to taking care of an issue that prior to that point, the only known, remedies wasn't a remedy at all. It was just to do nothing and let the market correct itself, which maybe it would have eventually, but I don't know what eventually is, Anyway, I'm not an economist. I don't know. But yeah, essentially the courts realized and FDR realized that any industrial economy is not bound by state borders. Industrialization leads to nationalization. That was the other part. A lot of industrialization happened at the time, and people were moving to factories, and factories were starting to do what would become mass production of stuff. Stuff was being shipped, things were proliferating. We really were becoming a national economy. So that was the second phess. Actually, yeah, that was the second phase, and we are still kind of in that phase right now. We are still in that phase for sure. We are less progressive than we were in the New Deal era, but we as a country are still, that is still the chapter we're in. So how does the federal government, regulate the economy? Or not even regulate the economy, but implement its policies across the states. So what they do is it's called fiscal federalism. So this is talking about grants and aid. So there are three different types of grants and aid: block grants, categorical grants, and unfunded mandates. So block grants are what conservatives would prefer, but honestly, everybody likes a block grant because it's literally just a bag of money. It's, here's some money, spend it. The other kind, and this is the most common kind, is categorical grants. Categorical grants is, here's some money, we want you to spend it on schools, and we have some guidelines that you need to follow. If you don't want to do that, that's cool, but you don't get the bag of money. That's a categorical grant. Unfunded mandates are, hey, we don't have a bag of money, but word just came down, this needs to be changed, and we need it done, I need this done in 2 years, or I need this done next month, or whatever, I need you transitioning over a 10-year period, whatever. Unfunded mandates are no fun because it requires the states to do stuff, and they are not compensated, and they don't really even get a say in it. So they are highly unpopular. And people, the president and the federal government generally try to avoid unfunded mandates, but it definitely happens. Anyway, so let's talk about where we are today. So a lot of things happened, since the end of the Cold War that have also changed federalism. So the best place to start is 9/11. That really shook things. That led to the Department. That led to the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security. It led to, an increase in, military power, build up in military presence overseas. The recession happened. The bailout happened. That changed how the federal government and how much power the federal government has, because they injected a bunch of money into the economy and injected a bunch of money into Wall Street to keep it floating. So that was an exertion of federal government power. COVID, that's going to change things. How we have dealt and continue to deal with that at a state and federal level is going to. We are in a new era now. We are in the COVID era. Everything before now we can call the pre-COVID era. The same way you can call it pre-9/11 or post-Cold War, whatever. Anyway, let's talk about Texas within the federal system. We've mainly been talking about federalism in the abstract. Let's talk a little bit about Texas. So Texas is very states' rights. We've talked about that going back to Texas political culture and where we kind of plant our feet. But Texas kind of takes it a step further. Texas is not the only ones, but Texas and other Republican states have rejected what they view as a coercive federalism. This kind of like the federal government getting more powerful over time, just as government gets, or as life gets more complex. Government gets more complex, but also things happen. Texas and other Republican states are trying to reject this drift. So what they do is they file lawsuits against the national government. So among these were the challenges to Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, to immigration laws, to gun laws, to, what was going on in the 2020 election. Texas tried to sue. I'm not exactly sure who. I'd have to look that up. But Texas and other Republican states make sure to go to the courts if they think that federal power is getting too big. That's for sure. So Texas is probably the state that is going to refuse maybe some federal dollars, and just do without. That might be a Texas policy, policy position on an issue. So what I want you guys to think about now, in Texas, sure, but also just in general. Political issues are political issues are vast, but when we're talking about a policy issue, we need to think of it within the context of the federalist system. So there is always going to be that push and pull between states and federal government. The 10th Amendment gives states power, but the Supremacy Clause makes the Constitution the supreme law of the land. The federal government is denied powers, yet the Necessary and Proper Clause allows the federal government to stretch its power. There's always this, and then there's just good old-fashioned politics involved as well. I can't do this because it's an election year and this would kill me, or the Senate's never going to go for that and it's just going to make me look ineffective. Stuff like that. So yeah, don't discount good old-fashioned politics. But anyway, federalism is important because it is essentially another form of checks and balances in the eyes of the framers. Checks and balances, the power of one, branch of government is checked by the other, et cetera, et cetera. So balance, power is used to offset power. Federalism is kind of the same thing. The states have power and they can flex their muscles, but the federal government can also flex its muscles, and this push and pull kind of keeps, again, for better or worse, chugging along with the status quo. But I think what the framers envisioned was that the status quo is good because it's at least stable. And a federalist system is a good way of stabilizing vastly different, regions, or in our case, states, where we have different political cultures. So yeah, federalism can get messy, but at the end of the day, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. And the fact that it's messy gives me a job, because we'll never run out of ways to interpret federalism or issues through the lens of federalism. But honestly, if I can make you guys understand that it is messy, that's fine. Understanding that it's messy is still helpful, because whenever messy things come up, it's not going to surprise you. You're going to be like, well, maybe this is a state's issue, or maybe the federal government could step in, I just want you guys to think about that. So lastly, I've got some graphs, or not graphs, I've got some figures and charts that kind of show some of the outcomes that can be explained by federalism. I'm just going to let you guys look at them, but what I want you guys to, I'll talk briefly about the expanded Medicaid for states that did not. So without going too much into healthcare, part of the Obamacare plan was to expand Medicaid so that more people would be eligible for it. Medicaid would be a way of getting healthcare. So what the federal government did is would provide money in return for states expanding Medicaid eligibility, because ultimately it's up to them, because that's a state's issue. And some states like Texas decided not to do it. They didn't want to do it. They thought it was unconstitutional. So Texas and some other states did not expand Medicaid. They just didn't, and they just held out and just didn't take any of the money that would have come with it. Now, the other states did. So if you look at this figure, what you'll see is that the states in blue are the states that expanded Medicaid. The average, the average uninsured rate is probably like 8%, 7%. There's a 4%, there's a 7%, there's an 11%, there's a 9%, Now the orange states, the ones that did not expand Medicaid, the uninsured rates are 13%, 13%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 12%, 14%, 9%, 8%, 17%. Texas is the 17%. Texas has the highest number of uninsured citizens in the country, has the highest percentage per state. So that just shows you how federalism does allow states to make their own decisions. Because for better or worse, Texas said, no, we don't want the growing power of the federal government to affect us regarding healthcare. We're going to just keep doing things the way we've been doing it, and we'll be fine. That's what Texas said. But yeah, that should show you just how much federalism allows for variance, which I guess in turn you could say relates to state autonomy, state sovereignty, because if Texas wasn't sovereign, Texas wouldn't be able to do this. You know what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, and then there's one on marijuana and which states have legalized and not. There's one with COVID on which states require masks. Anyway, you can look at those. But yeah, that's all I got, guys. Thanks so much.